Welcome everyone to today's presentation called Communities, Cookbooks, and Columbus. Local History Comes to Dinner. The Columbus-Lowndes Public Library System is excited to be hosting today's presentation. It's in conjunction with the Society of Mississippi Archivists. We have a Speakers Bureau type program through SMA, and so we're always here in Columbus interested in having speakers from SMA talk on their expertise. My name is Mona Vance Ali, and I am the archivist here at the Columbus-Lowndes Public Library. And I wanted to introduce today's speakers, and then we'll get started. Dr. Andrew P. Haley is an associate professor at the University of Southern Mississippi. His first book, Turning the Tables, American Restaurant Culture and the Rise of the Middle Class, 1880 to 1920, won the 2012 James Beard Award for Scholarship and Reference. Andrew is currently working on a book that explores how Mississippi community cookbooks tell the story of changing race relations, gender politics, and American nationalism in the 20th century. Our other presenter is Jennifer Brannock. She is a professor and curator of rare books and Mississippiana at the University of Southern Mississippi. In special collections at Southern Miss, she coordinates bibliographic instruction, supervises general reference activities, coordinates outreach efforts, curates exhibits, and conducts collection development and management activities for Mississippiana, rare books, and genealogy. She is currently working on a book proposal about Mississippi author Con Sellers, the lowbrow publishing industry and mid-century ideas of gender and sexuality. So I will now turn it over to Andrew and let you guys get started.
Hi, everyone, and thank you for coming out today. We want to talk to you about the culinary collection that we've been building here at Southern Miss, and I'm going to introduce that collection just a little bit, and then tell you about why we are collecting cookbooks, and then I'm going to pass it on to Jennifer, who will give a much more thorough explanation of what the collection is and how you might be able to use it if you're interested in recipes, in Mississippi history, in cooking in general. So the culinary collection, we started developing this, I just make up the dates, but it was about 5 or 6 years ago. And Jennifer, can we move on to the next slide? And it is a collection that has two core components. We are collecting cookbooks in general, Southern cookbooks specifically, and Mississippi cookbooks in particular. But we are also focusing our efforts particularly on community cookbooks. And so you see here an example of a community cookbook. This is the Hinds County Home Demonstration Cookbook, which is dear to my heart because the working title of my new research project I stole from this cookbook, Kiss and Don't Last, Cookery Do. And we have community cookbooks that were put together by home demonstration clubs. We have some that were put together by private clubs like the Globetrotters in Jackson, which were these, as the title suggests, folks who are traveling around the world collecting recipes. We have cookbooks from churches, from PTAs, parent-teacher associations. We have cookbooks from various clubs and organizations throughout the state. And we also have these authored cookbooks, these historical and many more recent cookbooks, such as the one that you see here. The infamous Wallace Simpson wrote this about Southern cooking. She was the Duchess of Windsor after she married Edward VIII, and he was forced to abdicate the throne in Britain. So if we go on to the next slide, you can see what we've accomplished in the past 6 years. And if you click it once here, Jennifer, we started with 20 cookbooks or so, 15, 20 cookbooks. We now have about 8,000 cookbooks from Mississippi, Alabama, and Louisiana, as well as important national and international cookbooks. And in that community cookbook collection, we have about 1,000 community cookbooks, including, in the part that's dear to my heart, about 250 historic cookbooks. These are cookbooks we're defining as from before 1970, all from Mississippi. So the question then is, why are we expending the time, energy, and resources and asking for volunteers from across the state to donate cookbooks? What is the value of these cookbooks? And so I'm a historian, and so my interest in this is largely related to history. And I want to tell you a little bit about my own research to kind of get us started, but I'll suggest some other possible uses, some other possible disciplines, and some other possible uses for these cookbooks. So if we can go to the next slide. Thanks, Jennifer. So this is an introduction from the Presbyterian Cookbook, which was one of the oldest cookbooks in the USM collection and one of the oldest cookbooks published in Mississippi. Historians think that Southern cooks were slow to produce locally created community cookbooks, in part because they had servants who were doing much of the cooking. But around the end of the 19th century, there's a kind of new enthusiasm for cooking, and the first cookbooks in Mississippi, community cookbooks in Mississippi, are published in the late 1890s and the early 20th century. So this is a pretty early one. And in the introduction, which was probably written by the minister of the church, he wrote, "Your work as an artist at the stove is different. You create an excellent recipe, give it to a friend, the friend gives it to another, and it spreads. You, as the creator of it, may never get the credit, and its spread will be like that of a folk song, passed from mouth to mouth. But in time, it'll become part of tradition." And in so many ways, that is what's so lovely about these cookbooks that we're collecting. They represent Mississippi's traditions. Despite what the minister said, those traditions can get lost if nobody collects the cookbooks. And so we are keeping a record of that tradition and how it's evolved over time. And that second part is where I come in, because that evolution of tradition and the changes in tradition and why communities created these cookbooks and what it says about them is what I've been doing my work on. So why do we collect community cookbooks? Next. Well, in part because these represent a history of culinary culture, the various fashions for different foods in Mississippi. For example, in the early 20th century, people loved to make their own ice cream on the Gulf Coast. And it was a very big deal, and cookbooks had whole sections dedicated to ice cream. There's also a history of the kind of dietary history. When did fresh food get replaced with canned foods? What particular foods were popular? When did people become more health conscious in their eating? There's also local history. As I said, these were published by churches and schools, and they represent the communities in which they were published. And so we can see a record as the number of casserole dishes increases and of women going to work for the first time in Mississippi. We can see in the diversity of recipes, the migration of immigrants to Mississippi communities and the development of new dishes. We can also see here, and this is what I'm going to emphasize a little bit more today, women's work being preserved. Mississippi community cookbooks are one of the few records of local women's activities. Now, sometimes we have some club records, and sometimes there are announcements about what women are doing in the women's pages of local newspapers. But in many small towns, those don't exist. The only publication that has survived in some cases is a community cookbook. Consider the fact that there are at least 2 towns in Mississippi that we have cookbooks for that no longer exist. One was wiped out by changes in the Mississippi River, and the other community completely died. And as far as I know, other than a few papers, legislative papers and state records, these community cookbooks are the most vibrant personal record of the people lived there and so, who lived in these communities. And so community cookbooks, which are often signed by the people who submit the recipes, are a record of individual lives that is just kind of unmatched, I think, in particularly rural states and southern states like Mississippi. So if we can go to the next slide, Jennifer. Now in Columbus, you have one of the great community cookbooks in Mississippi. The Choo Choo, which was written in 1951 and published in 1952 by the local chapter of the Junior Auxiliary, is just one of my favorite cookbooks, right? It has this fantastic hand-drawn cover, and throughout it, the recipes were handwritten by members of the Junior Auxiliary who, sat down at the table collectively and wrote out these recipes. In some cases, the original author of the recipe even wrote out the recipe, and they also illustrated in the most marvelous ways. So the devil's Swiss steak that you see here is a picture of the devil kind of spearing a cow or a steer. There's this wonderful picture that has been kind of superimposed over the recipe for a recipe for princess squares of a princess. And so, these cookbooks just offer a beautiful glimpse at the skill and talent of a community. Columbus will play an important role in the history of these community cookbooks because of the existence of the Industrial Institute and college. The IINC had a home economics department. In 1912, that home economics department published their own cookbook. And that cookbook is kind of an uber source for cookbooks in the state. Many people in the state were inspired, either went to the W and got a degree in home economics and then went back to their community where they helped to organize these cookbook efforts, or they had copies of this cookbook and they developed their own recipes from that cookbook. And so you come from a community in Columbus that is particularly rich in the way that in this history of local cooking in Mississippi. So, and the Choo Choo is a kind of typical example in some ways of the way these cookbooks help to bring together women and enhanced women's power. And that's what I want to talk about for a few more minutes here today, is to get into a little bit of the nitty gritty. I had hoped to speak more about the Choo Choo. I am still researching it. I'm still looking for stories about the Choo Choo and its origins and who wrote it. And let me tell you, if you have stories, please share them with me. I would love to hear from you. But in general, there are three ways, I think, in which these cookbooks help to empower women in their communities. First is the most direct way. Cookbooks like the Choo Choo were fundraising cookbooks. And so they raised money for causes that women cared about. In this case, because it was a junior auxiliary, the money from the Choo Choo went to children's causes in Columbus. Second, these cookbooks were places where women developed their organizational skills and power. It takes a lot to produce a cookbook like this. You need to do advanced sales in order to raise the funds in order to get it printed. Often you did this with advertising, and so women became experts on their local communities and solicited advertising. You then had to solicit the recipes, and you had to lay them out, and then you had to find a publisher for this, sometimes a local newspaper. In the case of the Choo Choo, they sent it to Chicago, I believe, to have it printed. And then you had to sell it and find a way to selling. That brought together a group of women. It developed the kind of skills that we often associate with men in business, and made them influential figures in their community. And that's the final part of how a book like the Choo Choo can help to translate women's interest in activism into sometimes even political power. Women used the expertise that they had in the home, and they were able to transfer that to a public role, right? And so the expertise that everybody agreed they had to produce a cookbook could in fact be the launching place for a more public voice in their community. As I said, I wish I could tell you a little bit more about the Choo Choo and the people who made it. I'm still working on that. But if we go to the next slide, I'll tell you a related story. It's related because the Dinah, which was published in Macomb, was the first of the junior auxiliary cookbooks to be published in Mississippi. In fact, probably the first junior auxiliary cookbook ever published. There had been some junior league cookbooks in Mississippi, particularly one in Meridian before this, but the junior auxiliary was created during the Depression years in 1935 in Greenville after two doctors who were working in the community noticed the high level of poverty and hunger and medical problems among the community's children. And he went to a woman who would become the society editor of the Delta Democratic Times and asked her to create a cookbook. She was her name's, sorry, I'm blanking out on her name here and I just have to glance down at my notes. Her name was Louise Eskridge, and it's her last name, Crump, I'm sorry, there we go, Louise Eskridge Crump. She was an incredible writer for the newspaper, really well respected, and wrote two novels of some renown in the kind of Gothic Southern literary tradition. But she took on the task of organizing the Junior Auxiliary, which becomes a powerful club organization, not just in Mississippi, but throughout neighboring states as well, and had clubs or chapters as far as Florida. One of the original clubs to join, at least by 1941, as best I can tell, was the Macomb Club. And it was only a few years after that that Macomb published their first cookbook, as I say, probably the first cookbook published by any junior auxiliary. And the Dinah is a remarkable cookbook in many of the same ways that Choo Choo is. And it's probably something of a template for Choo Choo, right? It has fantastic recipes, often from local celebrities. Here you see one from Hugh White, a governor of Mississippi, his wife. It also has fantastic locally created illustrations that are humorous. But there's a little bit more of a story that I can tell about the Dinah than I can tell about the Choo Choo, because I know a little bit about the woman who spearheaded the campaign to create this cookbook. Jennifer, can we go to the next slide? So the woman who organized the effort, she's not even mentioned in the cookbook, was Inez Alford. And when Inez Alford died, she got a small write-up in the Clarion Ledger, and it described her as the co-owner of the Denman Alford department store in Macomb, and as the homemaker. And that's about all it said. But that brief obituary really leaves out a lot, because for most of her life, she wasn't a co-owner of the department store. The department store would eventually be owned by her father-in-law and would eventually be handed down to her and her husband. And while her husband had worked in the department store all of his life, she worked at best off and on in the department store. Moreover, while she was definitely a homemaker, she did a lot more, and it all started with the cookbook. Inez Alford moves to Macomb in 1932 when she gets married, and she's originally from Louisiana. Now, her father-in-law at that time is the co-manager of the Denman Alford department store, and he was certainly an influential member of the community. Her husband was as well. He worked in the department store and he was active in the local Young Democrats. But for the most part, this is a typical middle-class family in Macomb. But during World War II, her husband will leave town in order to work for the railroads. It was just more, I believe, just more essential work that he could do during the war years. And during that time, she was alone. She gets involved locally in the Junior Auxiliary, and she takes on the project of organizing the cookbook. And organizing the cookbook, the kind of prominence it brings, begins her rise in the community, right? So this cookbook project makes her an influence in the community. By just after the cookbook is completed in 1946, she is serving on the local McCombs Parks Commission and is appointed chairperson of that committee. This was an issue she had cared about while she was in the Junior Auxiliary and while she was briefly president of the Junior Auxiliary. And she carries it over into public life. In 1948, she is pretty much the primary figure, the only figure who manages to create the Lakeshore Playground. And that's followed by 3 additional parks over the next few years that she's able to bring about by leveraging the funds raised by the diner and the influence of the Junior Auxiliary to get 4 playgrounds built in her community, staffed 10 hours a week with counselors. She retreats a little bit from public life right after that. She had her daughter who came down with polio, but she quickly goes back into public life as a leader of the March of Dimes efforts to raise money for polio in her community. She hosts all-women basketball games, eating contests, and eating and bake sales and other food events to raise money for that. And in 1953, as you can see, she is celebrated by the Enterprise Journal as the Mother of the Year. Now, by this time, her husband has caught up with her. He had served a brief stint in 1952 and 53 as mayor of Macomb. But what's interesting is, in 1954, the year later, the department store that her husband works in, that her father-in-law is essentially now running, and that she occasionally works in, moves to a new location in Macomb. And it results in a 6-page spread on the department store. And despite the fact that Inez is a part-time worker in the store, her picture and discussion of her charitable work is the most featured part, in some ways, of that 6-page spread on the store. I mean, certainly they talk about the store and the new location and the building and everything else, but she gets more attention than her husband and just about as much attention as her father-in-law. And I think it points to the fact that through the cookbook and the Junior Auxiliary, she has become this important cultural figure, this important political figure in her community. She will go on to work, tirelessly for dozens of other local community charities and continue to remain an influence in her community. But we often think of women and these community cookbooks as entities that are tied to the home, and I think that's incorrect. These community cookbooks become bridges to a public life for many women. Sometimes it happens at the beginning, as it does for Inez. Sometimes it happens in the middle of their story. If we go to the next slide. But what we can say for sure is that community cookbooks are built into the fabric of women's lives and women's politics in Mississippi. So for example, the cookbook issued by the Jackson Council of the United Daughters of the Confederate Veterans, first published in 1911, was largely the work, at least significantly the work, of Annabelle Power. Now, Annabelle Power would have been a significant individual in Mississippi history any way you look at it. Her father was the founder of one of the founders of the Clarion Ledger, and she had begun to involve herself in politics in the gubernatorial campaign of Edmund Knowles prior to the publication of this cookbook. But she was involved in this cookbook, and perhaps most importantly, she was involved in the republishing of this cookbook in 1953. And that moment when the cookbook was republished in 1953 coincided, and I don't think coincidentally, with the reinvention of her career. For years, she had worked in public service in various Mississippi government positions as secretary and both a kind of a typist, note-taking secretary, but also as a kind of assistant to various heads of departments in Mississippi government. But in 1953, she was in the process of reinventing herself as a journalist. And I think in some ways, the cookbook serves as an introduction. In the case of Coahoma Cooking, Every Day and Sunday Too, from the Coahoma Women's Club, this is actually the end of one woman's career, a kind of, we might say, a kind of swan song in her career. But it's what this cookbook and the women's club that created it was intrinsically linked to her life. Her name was Blanche Ralston, and she would be one of the most significant and influential women in Mississippi in the early 20th century. To list what Blanche Ralston did, the number of charities and organizations, clubs and political movements she was connected to would take, another hour. So I'm not going to do it. It's enough to say that she started by forming the Coahoma Women's Club in 1920. Within a few years, she was president of the statewide Women's Club. She turned that into influential roles on state commissions, 2 failed runs to become a member of the legislature, but she ended up serving on the Clarksdale Chamber of Commerce and is really behind the scenes the founder of the Clarksdale Annual Cotton Festival. She helped to establish the powerful Delta Council in the Mississippi Delta, and she was eventually appointed by the Roosevelt administration in 1935 as the regional supervisor of women's and professional work relief under the Works Progress Administration, where she supervised 12 southeastern states. There was a couple of other women who rose to that level of prominence in Mississippi in the early 20th century, but she really is an exceptional individual. And it all begins with her participation. I mean, there is no question that her prominence comes from the reputation she established as a hostess, as a cook, in the Coahoma Women's Club. And to kind of bring that all to an end at the very late in her career in the 1950s, she led the effort for all intents and purposes of putting together this cookbook, which is kind of in its own way a celebration of her life and her career as an influential hostess. So I raise all of this to suggest that, again, what we think of as sometimes women's marginal roles in society, the writing of cookbooks, is actually their mechanism of exercising power and influence. Not everybody who worked on a cookbook or produced a cookbook, of course, was interested in a larger political role, but definitely through their charitable work, through their local organizing, women who worked on these cookbooks were powerful players in shaping the communities they lived in. And so that's one reason we should be looking at and preserving these cookbooks. Jennifer, if we could go to the next slide. But we have a lot of these cookbooks. They all tell their stories. Some of those stories, like the Choo Choo, I'm still looking into and trying to figure out. But eventually, they usually reveal something about the people who were involved in writing those cookbooks. And the collection serves more than this kind of historical purpose. As you can see here, our cookbooks, you can kind of see here, our cookbooks span all of the 20th century and into the 21st century. They represent cookbooks by celebrities. They represent cookbooks by, we've gone a little wild, Jennifer. If you could move me to the slide after the display, that would be great, but I don't know. Yeah, there we are. Okay. And so, and I think these cookbooks are useful for a whole host of research purposes, right? So it's not just about history or tradition. These cookbooks are records of recipes that could be used by chefs and people in the entertainment and tourist industry. These are cookbooks that could be used by students of home economics who are looking for the ways in which foods change and become popular over time. These are cookbooks that can tell us about fundamental things about nutrition and how we eat. There's a growing movement among nutritionists to recognize that you can't just impose healthy food upon people, that you need to actually embed those healthy foods into traditional foods that people are already eating. And so these community cookbooks are kind of our avenue to be able to look at that. And so I'm hoping that scholars from all sorts of fields, from all sorts of regions of the American South will start using this collection. And I'm also hoping that you'll use the collection, right? Because this collection is for Mississippians. It's basically created by Mississippians for Mississippians. If there's a favorite recipe of your great aunt that you haven't seen in years, it may be in a community cookbook, and we would be happy to help you track it down. I'm going to hand things over to Jennifer, who's going to tell you more about the collection after she displays a bunch of graphics.
All right, so I'm going to talk a little bit about the kind of the nuts and bolts of the collections that we have here, and kind of how it came to be. So initially, probably about 10 years ago or so, the Special Collections received a small grant of maybe a couple $100 from the Committee on Services and Resources for Women, and they use that to buy cookbooks. So as Andrew mentioned earlier, I think we had maybe 20 community cookbooks that were Mississippi centric. So that's what we started with. And what we started doing was kind of looking at the potential, because, you know, I mentioned here collection development policy, and what you try to do is, you know, in libraries, you try to collect things based on a policy. And, you know, you want to look at what other institutions have in the state and in the country and kind of shape your collection around this policy. So we included cookbooks in there, and we really started to make it a very important part of what we collect, because every library in the state had an assortment of cookbooks, but not on the mass that, you know, the quality and quantity that we do. So then, you know, once Andrew and I started really focusing on this project, then it kind of, you know, it evolved. So, you know, of course, the collection started with community cookbooks, and, you know, that's really our bread and butter. That's what we love. That's what is kind of the books that you can't find anywhere. You know, we do have some celebrity ones or very prominent, you know, like Julia Child cookbooks, things like that are you know, important, but really these are the ones that no libraries have, that no one can get access to. And as Andrew said earlier, you know, hunting down like your grandmother, your mother's recipes, you know, we had a situation probably about 4 or 5 years ago where Andrew was given a talk, and one of my coworkers went through the cookbook to prepare something, because we do a little potluck with his talks. And in it, she found the lemon cake that was her mother's, that they had lost the recipe for. So it was really cool that, you know, they were able to get this recipe out of it. But then on the flip side, you know, when we've had people come to our talks where we have these recipes, we had some people come from out of town for a cookbook that the woman's mother had participated in, and the recipe that mom had submitted was false, because she didn't want anybody to have her recipe. So she submitted a completely fake recipe, which kind of goes against the point of, you know, sending for the recipe. But, you know, how we find these, you know, a lot of it, I go to a lot of estate sales. You know, I'd like to say I go just for the cookbooks, but, but I go for everything else too. You know, go to estate sales where you can find, you know, what people had, you know, and so often with estate sales, you have families who don't see the benefit of cookbooks anymore, because people just go online to find recipes oftentimes. Also the older cookbooks, you know, what's little Jimmy going to do with a 1942 cookbook? You know, I mean, you know, it just doesn't really work. So that's why these estate sales have a lot of these, you know, these books, because families don't know what to do with them. Also, a lot of online booksellers. I go to bookfinder.com. That's my rare book, used book site. And I go there to kind of just search every so often. I'll do a search for Mississippi cookbook and just kind of scour through and see what's there. eBay is what I use a lot. But there's a guy like outside of Jackson in Carthage, and Colonel Reb, You know, he's the bane of my existence because he knows that we collect these really old, rare cookbooks. And so before they were at a reasonable price, and now they're not so reasonable. So Andrew and I have to come together and it's like, do we want to pay, you know, this much money for a community cookbook, you know, but he knows he's got us. So it kind of ticks me off. But that's, you know, so eBay, you can find a lot of good stuff. But, you know, sometimes I can find books on eBay for $2, you know. I am Andrew taking on Colonel Reb in public. The, you know, of course, most of our collection came from donors, you know, whether it's Mississippi donors. We had one gentleman from Virginia who grew up in Carthage, funny enough, who's had collected a lifetime of cookbooks. So we got, including a lot of very, very famous classics. So this cookbook here, I'm going to guess early 1960s. Andrew, do you have any idea when Recipes of the Deep South, The Legend of the Dogwood? I don't know. That's a great point. Great question.
Sorry about that. I was muted for a moment. Yes, I will let you guys know in a second. We know what the date is on that. I just don't know it off the top of my head, but I'll let you guys know in the chat.
But, you know, so often too, we, with these cookbooks, they don't put dates in it. There are all these things now that just having spent so much time with cookbooks that I'm like, oh, how come they don't include like a copyright date or when it was published or even what city it's in? Sometimes it'll just say the Baptist Church. I'm like, you know, I mean, it makes it hard for us to kind of wrangle down. But like with Andrew's research, you know, he goes through like Ancestry.com and these genealogy sites. And that's how often we have to track down where these, you know, who these people are and where these were published. And of course, sometimes we get donations from libraries as well, because from what I understand, a lot of times they don't sell as, you know, these older community cookbooks don't sell as well in book sales. So sometimes we get donations from there. But one thing that, you know, when searching online sites, I find that no one can spell Mississippi. So in eBay, I have to go in and do, you know, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different searches for Mississippi because, and you just don't think, you know, now you're all going to go back. Now, you know, Mona, you know, all you library people are going to go in going, MISSISSIBBI, you know, and see what comes up because you have sometimes it'll, you know, you'll find some that way. So this is just a donation of some stuff that we received. You know, I like Weight Watchers cookbooks. That's kind of my little weird, you know, side project that I do. So you can see here, I'm posing with a Weight Watchers one. But this is just a donation. You know, and this is how, you know, I look at them all, compare them to what we have in the catalog, and kind of what, you know, what's available. So, you know, a lot of times too with our cookbooks, you know, when we get them, we want to make sure we trace them back to the originator. So if Marcia Hester gives us her family cookbook, then in the record we'll say donated by Marcia Hester. And that's just a way to make sure that these cookbooks remain with the women who owned them, you know. So, and also it's a way to preserve you know, a library collection. So if Ellen Ruffin gives 50 cookbooks, then we can do a search in our library catalog for Ellen Ruffin, and then it'll bring up all these cookbooks that she has donated. So it's just a way for us to not only have the cookbooks, but also, you know, preserve and the ownership of the people. And so you can see here, this is our, you know, just a search for community cookbooks in our Mississippi collection. This is just our Mississippi ones for now, and this is just titles. So like some of these, like Choo Choo, I think we have 3 or 4 copies of Choo Choo because we like the different editions, because you can see different edits between them and stuff. So these are just titles that we have, and not some of those, the Women's Club ones or some of the Jackson ones. I mean, they have like 45 editions, you know, so we have a number of different ones to kind of track the way different things are, you know, different publications. And you can see here for Choo Choo, just kind of how we use the make sure to maintain the donors. So you can see here under local notes that there is a mentioning that it was donated by Wendy Cartwright. And so that's a way for it to be, to keep that donorship there. Also, if we have things above it, you'll see enclosures on file. So whenever we have, a lot of times, you'll have prayer cards or other recipes thrown into cookbooks or just little notes. We keep all those. We keep them on file, and we link them to the book so that you can go to the file for this edition of Choo Choo and look and see what was included in there. Also, we digitize things and make them available online. And so generally, most of the stuff we have digitized, we have a lot of civil rights materials, we have a lot of Mississippi history, a lot of child lit, but we also have cookbooks. And so I've been cookbooks that are out of copyright or have not been renewed for copyright. We do include and digitize and include them in our online collections. And Andrew and I just last year received a $11,000 grant for the sole purpose of digitizing and transcribing Mississippi cookbooks. And it was really cool because it was an international grant. So we had all these people from, like the Smithsonian and, Boston University, I think, Boston College, and then some places in Great Britain. But I think we were doing the most with our stuff. So we had some really cool stuff. We provide all this descriptive information again, just so you have more information as you're looking through the digital collections. And these are fully downloadable and printable and things like that. And then just a little bit about how we, talk with the community. We love giving talks to, women's club groups and garden clubs and DARs and, libraries and just different groups to talk about it. Because we think it's I think it's a fun collection, I think it really emphasizes women's history and women's importance in a way that history does not, because history has always been very white male centric, and so to be able to show that, women in Macomb, can have a very important a very important part of their community history and and what happens in the town. It's just not relegated to their husbands. But we do these annual cookbook talks. We've had, a couple of profiles in some of the local publications. And here's a little video. And so we won't go too far into it, but that just shows you, some of the exposure that we have, but also that gives you a little glimpse into the cookbook talks. So every year, Andrew gives a talk where he focuses on one cookbook generally, and then we prepare a potluck, so using recipes from the cookbook. So anybody can participate, and we've had some, it's so funny. It's one of those potlucks where you tell people to eat before they come because you just don't know. You just don't know. Sometimes there are a lot of casseroles that are just, I'm not a casserole person, so there are casseroles which I just think are weird, or, a lot of gelatin creations, so just some weird stuff. But so these are some of the cookbook talks. So we've been doing these since 2014. Our next one is going to, Andrew is going to do one in late October, so on October 29th at 12:15. We're also going to have another one of his cookbook talks, and then we're hoping to do the potluck. So if anybody wants to participate, we'll just spend a couple minutes at the beginning of it to kind of be like, here's what I made. It tastes horrible. And Andrew always says, how people look so fondly back on their family recipes when really probably most of them weren't as good. It's just the memories of them and the family, and probably the, having family around and stuff is what's good, but maybe the food not as much. But the talk will be online, and we'll publicize it through our special collections page. And this just shows you how we, for the potluck, we take we make sure with each item that we have the recipe with it. And so you can see these were ones that were created for, you know, a recent, you know, a past talk. I love Catalina dressing, and this French dressing recipe is Catalina. It is awesome. It is so easy to make. So that's my takeaway on that one. But the Anne's macaroni loaf, you look at that and you're like, it's a macaroni loaf. I don't know what to think about that. It was really, really good. It was really good. And then the crisp cheese biscuits, you know, and it's just kind of a bunch of weird little things. The shrimp buffets, I don't know as much about that, but we'll just go on. And then of course, you know, I've given presentations, you know, for different library, different groups that we had where I've highlighted the stuff. You know, I always tell this one story. So I gave a talk at I think it was this one, Rare Books and Manuscript section of the American Library Association, and they so I gave my talk about the Cookbook Project. This was very early on, and RBMS is a very fla-fla organization. I mean, it's where all your Ivy League people go, people with tons of money, and, you know, that whole thing, everything that comes along with that. So I gave my talk, and it was, you know, it was good. It was good. You know, I always emphasize how, you know, and I don't know if I mentioned this in Andrew's bio before, I think so, but, you know, he's a James Beard Award winner, which is really impressive. And, you know, we have another James Beard Award winner in Forest County in Hattiesburg. And so to have two James Beard Award winners, which is a huge deal in Forest County. So I may have kind of thrown that in my presentation a little bit. So it went fine. But then afterwards, I was taking a little transport back to the hotel, and this girl was sitting across from me. She goes, "Oh, I really like your talk." I was like, "Oh, you saw it? Well, thanks. I'm so glad. You know, we have a lot of fun with it, and, you know, we don't have as much means as like the Harvards or the Yales have." I said, "But we have the freedom to do whatever we want. We've gotten really good at doing a lot with not much money." So we just are very passionate about this project. And she goes, "Well, I wish we, you know, did stuff like that at my institution. It's just not, there's no way to engage the community and stuff." I was like, "Oh, where do you work?" And she said, "Harvard." And I was like, so in my mind, I'm like, yeah, you know. And it was just because really, you know, USM is great in many ways, but, you know, just to be able to, we can do so much here, and we do really cool stuff. So, and then recently, Andrew and I had a book chapter that came out in Digital Humanities, and a Digital Humanities Libraries and Partnerships books about our partnership on this project. Okay, Andrew, are you gonna swing in here?
Yeah, I'll thank you, Jennifer. I think that it's not possible for me to express enough gratitude to Jennifer and to libraries, university libraries at Southern Miss for taking on a project that I think a lot of institutions would have been reluctant to do, in that it is these are the kind of sources, as Jennifer emphasized, that for many years, it's changing for sure, but for many years, libraries ignored too often. When we first started this, one of the things that we discovered or realized is that one of the best collections of recipes and information about cooking that we had in the collection was buried in the Governor Johnson papers, Johnson Jr.'s papers, because his wife's records from the time that he was governor, her recipes for entertaining, were part of that collection. But what was interesting about that, right, is that they were not collected because she was significant or the recipes were significant. They were kind of incidental part of collecting a governor's papers. And so I do think that one of the things that's amazing about this collection is the way it gives voice to women in the state of Mississippi. And we want to continue to do this. I will say we have made a lot of progress. When we started, I estimated that there were about 100 community cookbooks published before 1970 that we would, and if we could get those, we would have something like a complete collection. We now have 250, and I know for sure we don't have a complete collection. And so, you know, one of the things we always have to do in one of our talks is reach out to all of you, to people you may know, to talk to people you may know who may have these community cookbooks, because the truth of the matter is they are becoming increasingly hard to find in any purchasable locations. It is the cookbooks that buried in your attic, the ones that that are, you know, are kind of lost to history that we need at this point in time. So if you have those, contact myself, or in particular Jennifer, but she's so much better at this than I am, because we really would love to have you be a part of this collection. So. And with that, you know, we're open to all sorts of questions, and I know we probably ran a little longer than we wanted to because I'm long-winded, but we'd be happy to stick around for as long as you want to talk to you, answer questions. So.
Well, I have one question really quick. Do you guys take your presentation, with the caveat that this would be post-COVID, would you guys be willing to take your presentation and cooking event up to Columbus?
Oh, absolutely. We'd love to do that. In fact, Jennifer, you were not there for this one. I'm sorry, but I went to Waynesboro, the public library there, and they have quite a Friends of the Library program, and they prepared a little like recipes from the cookbook I was talking about. And so we could do something like that. Absolutely, we'd love to do that.
Because that would be something that I know our local community would be very engaged in. Again, once we get back to normal.
Yes, unfortunately these days, the best we can do is do this online and ask you to go to the online collection, go to special collections at Southern Miss, pick out one of these cookbooks and make yourself some chicken spaghetti tonight. So.
It looks like we may have some questions in the chat box. Please tell me what criteria you use to determine what is a good addition to your collection, just in case I run across something.
Jennifer, do you want
Valerie Craig.
Yeah, hey Valerie. Valerie's one of our big time, she always contributes to our potlucks. So usually, I mean, we really are interested in Mississippi community cookbooks at this point. We've gotten to the point now where we aren't accepting duplicates really. So if we already have a copy, we don't need one, but still, you know, let me know. I had a woman who must have seen the publicity for this and wrote me and, you know, had mentioned that she was interested and she had some that she would be willing to donate. But the you know, Mississippi community cookbooks, we love pre-1970 are our favorites. But if there's ever a situation, I mean, you know, you want to send a list of books, we can go through them, or if it's, you know, maybe pre-COVID, you know, post-COVID, we can, you know, we've gone to people's houses and spent hours going through cookbooks and just, you know, seeing what people have before they, you know, sell them or do whatnot.
It'll be a little oversimplistic, but it's probably fair to say the older the cookbook, the less likely it is, the more likely it is that we are looking for a copy of it, because just the older ones are harder to find. And some of the older ones that we have in the collection are in poor condition, and might be that we want to. If we could find a better condition one, we would want to have that. I should also say that while Jennifer is absolutely the expert on this, and it's true, we're not collecting a lot of duplicate titles. We are looking for different editions of the same cookbook. One of the curious things about the Macomb cookbook, which is unique to it, is that it came out repeatedly after 1946. There was a 50s version and a 60s version and a bicentennial version in 1978. And the weird thing is they added to the cookbook at the end. And so you can see the changes over time. They didn't actually just integrate those recipes into the cookbook. But most cookbooks are not like that. And so in order to see change in the community over time, you need to be able to compare the earlier copies with the newer copies, right? And so sometimes we'll have one from, like the Boonville cookbook that I quoted early on. We have the 1948 edition. We would love to have the 1912 or 1914 edition of that to see what the differences are.
Anyone else have any other questions? All right.
Well, it's so kind of you to have. It's so kind of you folks to have us. We really, this is a project of love that we spend way too much time on, and we just love to talk to people about the collection. And it is truly unique. It is the largest collection in Mississippi. It is one of the largest collections of cookbooks now anywhere in the kind of Gulf South area. There are some other great collections. The Food and Beverage Museum down in New Orleans, for example, has a fantastic cookbook library. There is a marvelous collection of African-American cookbooks at the University of Alabama, but our collection is really distinct in how thoroughly representative of the state it is. There's pretty much, there are very few collections that have managed to dig as deeply into their own state's history and to create this kind of complete record. And so we are very proud of it. Yeah.
Well, I second y'all's enthusiasm. I'm really excited that you guys have done this. I think it's really critically important. So I want to tell both of you guys thank you. But if anyone else has any questions, we can jump in now. Otherwise, we'll give it another minute and then we'll say thank you and till next time. So, all right, we've got, looks like no more questions, but lots of thank yous. So thank you, Jennifer. Thank you, Andrew. And I hope you guys have a great rest of your day.
Thanks for having us again, and do visit the online collection. It is also one of the largest online collections of cookbooks available anywhere. So it's really fantastic.
Oh yeah, thank you for the link in the chat box. There's a link to the online digital collection. Thank you, Deborah.
Yeah, that's my webpage for it. It is getting a bit out of date and hopefully will be replaced soon. I keep saying that, but it will link you to the library's collections as well.
Okay, so. Okay, gotcha. Well, otherwise, I hope everyone has a great day. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, y'all. Thanks.
Bye.